Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, in my day job as Easton Antique Arms, luckily I get to handle lots of swords. What a great job. I sometimes get asked on this channel to talk about swords that are kind of outside what I normally talk about, so other nationality swords or other types of weapons, not just swords incidentally. And here I've got one which is, I don't think I've ever featured one on the channel before. Maybe if I have done, it was quite long ago. I've probably only ever had about 4 or 5 of these through. They're not massively common in the UK, but I'll talk about that in a second. What is it? So it's an Italian Model 1833 mounted artillery sabre. Okay, so we'll look at the scabbard again in a minute, but there's the blade for you. Basic characteristics: it's a single-edged sabre blade, not particularly long, kind of medium length. I think it's about 33 inches, 32 inches, something like that, with a spear point, so it does have a slight false edge. You'll know that notice that the point is central to the blade, so not at the back like lots of French swords are. That's good, so it's good for thrusting, or pretty good for thrusting. It's a compromise cut and thrust design, pretty good for cutting. This example has been service sharpened at some point in its life. And these did have a long service life. So you'll notice I called it the Model 1833. Italian as well. Well, many of you will know that Italy wasn't yet unified in 1833. And in fact, the study of Italian swords in this era, in the 19th century, in fact, the study of Italian swords in the Napoleonic era and post-Napoleonic era, 19th century, is actually pretty complicated. We do actually find quite a lot of antique Italian swords in Britain. I can't say exactly why. Maybe they were bringbacks from World War I, World War II, I don't know. Probably it's just down to tourism. There's always been quite a lot of British people who've gone on holiday to Italy. I spent my entire childhood going on holiday to Italy, and in fact my grandparents used to live in Italy as well, so I've got quite a strong personal connection to Italy. And I suspect that just lots of these were bought in antique shops and markets and stuff over probably the post-war years, so probably late 40s and then 50s, 60s, so, and probably before the Second World War as well. And these were brought back to Britain probably as curios or kind of wall-hanging decorations. But they are military swords. And in fact, I mentioned these have I'm kind of skipping around here. I'll come back to the Model 1833 designation in a second. But these did have a long service life, this type of sword. And there are a few variations, but this general look of sword, so the characteristics being that cut and thrust blade we've looked at here, the single knuckle bow, no side bars on it, and a hilt which is quite Georgian in design. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well. And these did have a long service life. You'll notice that this scabbard, which I said I'd come back to and I'm now coming back to, is a typical steel scabbard of a military type used by many nations in the 19th century. But it only has one ring attachment. Now, my understanding is that the earlier ones, the earlier scabbards, do have a double ring attachment, and later on they were modified or the scabbards were replaced to have a single ring attachment. And generally, the general rule is with European military swords that if you have a single ring attachment, that usually means it's a later period, usually 1890s, 1900, World War I. And these swords were still being carried, I believe, issued to mounted artillery in World War I. So if we call this the 1833 model, then in theory these were in use from 1833 until 1918, which is a very, very long service life for a military sword in the 19th century, because as you guys know, all countries, and I usually focus on Britain, but all countries went through a lot of different military sword patterns during the 19th century. They were constantly changing the design of the guard or the blade, or sometimes the entire sort of style of the sword, partly because of this ongoing debate between cut and thrust, partly I think kind of keeping up with the Joneses, should we call it, kind of like they wanted to, if France got a new model of sword, then Britain thought, well, we need to get a new model of sword, so it looks like we're keeping up with military technology, this kind of thing. Now, coming back to a couple of points I've touched on already, this is in design quite a Georgian looking sword. What do I mean by Georgian? Well, that's obviously a British history expression. It refers to the reigns of George I, II and III, and in fact George IV as well, Prince Regent, and then George IV. So we're really talking about a period which covers most of the 18th century and all the way up to the 1830s. I think 33, if I remember correctly, William IV came in. So we're talking about a very big period of time, but really what I mean when I say Georgian is Napoleonic. So what do I mean when I say this has quite a Napoleonic look to it? Well, quite simply, if you look at Napoleonic era swords, things like the 1796 light cavalry sabre, the French and Prussian equivalents, and then if you look at Victorian period swords, you'll notice that generally speaking there was a move to 3-bar hilts and then even more kind of forms of shell hilt and stuff, generally speaking. We do actually have types of shell hilt, obviously, in the Napoleonic period, and we do have 3-bar hilts even in the modern day, right the way through to modern regulation in France and Britain and elsewhere. So in fact, it's not as clean cut as that, but there is a general tendency in appearance of development from the Napoleonic era into middle 19th century and then late 19th century swords and early 20th century swords. And there are some general tendencies. And this sword does look quite like some swords that were around in the Napoleonic Wars, both Prussian and other German state swords. It also looks like some Austro-Hungarian hussar sabres. In fact, if we're honest about it, it looks like some Polish and Hungarian swords from the 17th and early 18th century. So it actually does look like a classic hussar sabre or shabla. Little details like these languettes, for example, that are here. The style of the backstrap, the very straight style of the knuckle bow here. It just has actually quite an old school hussar look to it. So it looks like 18th century hussar sabres. And it doesn't look unlike, like I say, it doesn't look unlike some of the classic Polish hussar sabres of the 18th century and even earlier. So it's quite an old school design to be coming in 1833. But also I mentioned about the fact that Italy wasn't unified. So we call this the Italian model 1833, but that's kind of an unofficial name and it's kind of not a very precise name. It's kind of not correct. And the reason, as I understand it from my good friend Matthew Ford, who is studying Italian swords, writing a book about Italian swords and is far more knowledgeable on it than me. If I've understood from him correctly, this model started out as a Sardinian, I believe, model of sword. And it kind of spread from Sardinia into other Italian states. And then, of course, post-Italian unification in 1860-ish, if I remember correctly, under Garibaldi, then certain models of sword were made into Italian models of sword rather than individual state swords. So obviously you had Naples, Sardinia, you've got various different parts of Italy formed into one country, and then they adopted certain models as the kind of national models as they were. But even then, even after that, there are still models that you find with officers' swords, for example, from Naples that are completely different from a similar officer's sword from Milan. Okay, so Italy is very, very complex in terms of studying 19th century swords, because Italian history in the 19th century is very complex, and Italy wasn't really a unified country until more than halfway through the century. So as I understand it, this probably started out before 1833, which might hint at why it looks quite 18th century in design. Now, one of the things that, especially for British sword collectors, you need to be aware about this sword and familiarise yourself. Even if you're not interested in Italian swords, you need to familiarise yourself with the Italian 1833 mounted artillery sword, because it is very often sold in some dealers. Not usually, but very occasionally. I have seen it in dealers who aren't necessarily that expert on swords. And I have seen it in auction house descriptions described as a British 1788 light cavalry sword. The 1788 model, which I've shown on my channel before, was the predecessor to the 1796 light cavalry sabre. And it does look a bit like this, but they're usually a bit bigger. Okay, so the Italian mounted artillery sword is a bit like a scaled down version of the 1788, but there are other differences. The 1788 usually has double fillers. There are some differences in the design of the hilt. But at first glance, and for the uninitiated, they do in fact look a bit like a 1788. And for example, if a filmmaker was making a movie set at, the retreat from Corunna or something in the early Napoleonic Wars, and they used these for British light cavalry, I actually would spot that, but I actually wouldn't really complain. I'd go, oh, that's very clever, because they've used far cheaper and more abundant Italian 1833 models as 1788s, because they do look passingly similar. Okay, so they're kind of like almost, I won't call them imitation, but they're almost like they could be a pretend 1788. But if you're intending to buy a 1788, which might cost you in the high hundreds of pounds, or over £1,000 for a very nice example, you don't want to be paying that kind of money if you're actually paying for, or actually buying an Italian 1833, because these are later, they're much more common. I'm afraid to say they have less historical interest than the Napoleonic 1788 patterns. So familiarise yourself with both. You can just Google image search Italian model 1833 sword, and then Google image search British 1788 light cavalry sword, and familiarise yourselves with differences. The other thing which adds to the confusion is the British 1788, although it's a pattern, it's quite a loose pattern, so there's quite a lot of variation within the pattern. So some of the British ones look more like this, some of them look less like this in various angles of the grip and this kind of stuff. Right, so the other thing that I was going to talk about this is the general design of it. So I've said, like, kind of general cut and thrust blade. It's a nice sabre blade. It feels very sturdy. It's sturdily built. I'll talk a little bit about the construction in a second. It's a nice chunky sword. It feels quite like the some of the Polish sabres. It's kind of robust, and it feels like sturdy in your hands. But in terms of the hand protection, lots of you might go, oh, well, I don't like it because it doesn't have as much hand protection as a 3-bar hilt. But always remember context. Who is it for? Mounted artillery. What do mounted artillery spend most of their time doing when they're actually engaged in combat? Getting on and off horses, or on and off the limber and the actual gun itself, the artillery piece, the cannon, and loading and firing the cannon. Okay, so if you're in the mounted artillery, sometimes you might act as cavalry. It did happen occasionally. Sometimes you might draw your sabre and actually like do a bit of a cavalry action if needed, if there are no cavalry around. But most of the time you're going to be hitching up your gun and its limber, carrying the ammunition and everything else to your horses, riding quickly to a place, unlimbering, getting the gun out, shooting at the enemy, relimbering, getting it back up, moving to another place, shooting at the enemy, blah, blah, blah. So this is quite a labour-intensive job. And you don't want your sword to be getting in the way. When you wear a simple knuckle bow against your side, it's far less likely to get in the way. Equally, you don't have an overly long blade. It's a serviceable enough length, but it's not as long as if we just grab a French light cavalry sword here. So this is a 36-inch blade, so the Italian one is about 33-inch, I think I said. So, you know, it's still got decent enough length that you're not at a huge disadvantage fighting someone with a longer blade. Or fighting anyone obviously with a similar length blade. So it's a good fighting weapon, but it's not so big it's going to get in the way. It doesn't have a hilt that's going to get in the way. It sits comfortably against your side. It's not going to chafe. So great. So I think for the purpose, it's actually a really, really good sword, and I can see why they stayed in use for such a long time, because it's a sort of very practical and decent design. One comment about the construction, which I said I would talk about. So Italian sword hilts are made in a very particular way, and from this 1833 pattern onwards, right the way through into the 20th century, they have certain peculiarities that you don't necessarily find with other nation swords. One of those is this knob you see at the top, okay, that little hemisphere. Just get it focused in here. This hemisphere here is actually separate to the rest of the backstrap, and it is a nut. So you might be able to see there the actual thread coming through the end, and you can literally turn that to tighten that up, or you can undo it and dismount the whole hilt, which is great for maintenance. And you know, it's if your hilt gets a bit loose, it's quite easy to tighten it up. If you need to replace a part, it's fairly easy to take it off, get a new bit from the armoury, replace it. So yeah, I quite like that actually. That's quite nice and practical. And also everything kind of locks in with a lot of Italian hilts, particularly with this one. So one way that things lock in together, and this is a design which is taken from earlier Polish and Hungarian sabres, and we also find on swords from the Islamic world such as Kilich and Shamshirs and stuff like that, is this langet which goes across this crosspiece. So it came into the West from interaction probably mostly with the Ottoman Turks, and this helps secure in the grip here, and when it's on the scabbard it also helps secure against the side of the scabbard as well. So that is an interesting construction that sort of binds everything together and protects that. The ferrule at the bottom, which prevents the grip from splitting at the top end, and at the bottom end the pommel cap prevents that splitting. So these langets help. And then also, quite peculiar to this model, there is a hole there, a peg hole, and that is actually where there is a peg which unfortunately on this example has actually been broken off short, but there is a peg going from the back strap up into the guard, so the back strap locks into the guard as well. So this locks to this locks to that, and obviously the nut at the end tightening everything together and securing it. So it's an interesting construction. It's actually quite complex. It's quite machined in a way. It's a bit like more modern world things you'd think of, like bayonets and stuff like that, all bits of machinery, you know, from tractors and steam engines and whatever. So it's quite engineered, quite robust, easily replaceable, tighten upable, this kind of thing. So it's a cool construction. So there we go. I'm wrapping up there. It's an interesting sword. I think it's very fit for purpose. It's a good sword. Just if you want a nice knuckle-bowed sword. It's also good for left-handers, I should mention. I do get left-handers coming to me in my day job at Eastern Antique Arms saying that I'm a left-hander, but so many of these swords are, and they are, built for right-handed people because the guard protects the side of your hand that projects out, and if you're left-handed, there's not very much on that side to protect it, and that is really annoying. I'm very lucky personally in that I write with my left hand, but I do everything else with my right hand, so I'm sort of left-handed and right-handed, but I use swords with my right hand. But knuckle bow, so they are symmetrical, which gives them a nice balance. It means they're light at the hilt end, generally speaking, as well. You get all of the energy into the tip of the blade, and they move very nicely. But for left-handers, that's great because left-handed or right-handed, the sword's the same. Okay, so they're really underrated swords. Actually, I rate them highly. If you like different kinds of swords, and also if you're a fan of the earlier, or in some cases more expensive as well, kind of hussar sabres, this is a more affordable option, and they're relatively easy to get hold of. There's quite a few of them around. So a nice sabre, fit for purpose, well made, easily cleanable, modifiable by virtue of the fact you can take the hilt apart fairly easily. And yeah, I'm quite a fan of them. This is going off to a customer now in the United States. Eastern Antique Arms incidentally does ship all over the world, and more than half of my sales go to America these days, which is great. So anyway, I hope this has been a useful and interesting video for you. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you really soon on Scholar Gladiatori channel for another video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.